Was Aaron Kosminski Jack the Ripper?
This silk shawl is believed to be the last piece of physical evidence left from his killing spree more than 130 years ago. Two biochemists who analyzed it say they detected the DNA of Catherine Eddowes, Jack the Ripper's fourth victim, in apparent bloodstains. They also found a semen stain they believe came from Aaron Kosminski, a 23-year-old Polish barber who at the time was a prime suspect.
Could this be the end of this century-old mystery? This is Unsolved True Crime. In 1888, 5 sex workers were murdered by a killer from the streets of London. In this episode, we will profile one of the suspects.
It's been called the oldest profession by some. In some places and times, it was considered a religious practice, and others, a crime. The act of sex working is as old as civilization, perhaps older. And while its participants are usually thought of as women, men have also been and had the distinction of being sex workers. And as with many other vocations, there are levels, from concubine to call girl, from geisha to streetwalker. Each has had their own tier and their own set of rules, risks, and rewards. The upper echelon professionals certainly would have more security and prestige than their less glamorous counterparts. In our more modern times, the selling of sex for money or other compensation has taken many forms other than the obvious. With the advent of the internet, OnlyFans and other similar platforms are paid to play for clientele seeking to buy attention or favor. This is the business of voyeurism and enticement, where image and fantasy are key. They are niche markets for those wanting niche appetites satisfied as well. To sex workers and their clientele, the relationship is quite different, transactional on every level. For those participating, the reasons vary, money being a prime motivator as, for those actually making films, they can acquire more in a short span than others could make in years or decades. Of course, such activity has, in and of itself, a short functional lifetime. Literally. Many performers have substance abuse issues and psychological problems that have led to or from their work. And a great number of those involved in the industry die young. Money and addictions, some have kept them trapped in a cycle they cannot easily escape. For some, the lure of easy money is one they cannot ignore, especially when economic times are hard and resources scarce. In counterpoint, there are places where the profession is treated as a profession, with standardization, medical benefits, and the like. They are, however, the exception and not the rule. I've heard it said that a person will go to a sex worker to get a need met that is not satisfied elsewhere. In today's world, relationships are becoming harder to establish and maintain, and statistics show that fully 1/3 of men are not actively engaged in sex within the past year, and at least 1/4 of men are in sexless marriages. The reality is, there has always been a need for sex work in one form or another, from dominatrix to call girl. The stigma of engaging in or seeking such services is something that society must wrestle with on its own terms. Some countries accept such endeavors while others actively prosecute them. The need, however, remains.
On September 29, 1888, Catherine Eddowes was taken into police custody for being drunk in public. The next day, Catherine would be found dead.
Police Constable Louis Robertson of the City of London Police was walking his beat along the High Street when he noticed a crowd gathered on one of the pavements, laughing at something. Pushing through them, he found that the source of their amusement was a drunken woman, whom he later identified as Catherine Eddowes, who was entertaining the crowd with an imitation of a fire engine. Having taken a bow, she lay down on the pavement and went to sleep. Constable Robertson asked if any of the onlookers knew who the woman was. None of them did, so the officer hauled her to her feet and propped her up against the shutters of one of the shops. She promptly slid back down onto the pavement. Robinson summoned the assistance of a colleague, Constable George Simmons, and together they manhandled her round to Bishopsgate Police Station. Here, when asked her name, Kate replied, "Nothing." The officers placed her in a cell and left her to sober up. At 9:45 that night, the city jailer, George Hutt, came on duty and took over responsibility for the prisoners in the cells. He checked on her several times over the next few hours, and each time found that she was fast asleep. By 12:15 on the morning of the 30th of September, she had woken, and Hutt heard her singing softly. A quarter of an hour later, she called to him and asked when she would be allowed to leave. "When you can take care of yourself," Hutt called back. "I can do that now," came her reply. At 12:55 a.m, he brought her from the cell and told her that she could go. He pushed open the swing door to the passage and said, "This way, missus." As she walked to the outer door, she asked him what the time was. "Too late for you to get any more drink," observed Hutt. "I shall get a damn fine hiding when I get home," she sighed. Hutt was not in the least bit sympathetic. "And serve you right," he replied. "You have no right to get drunk." Hutt escorted her to the station's side door, which exited onto the dark and narrow Rose Alley, which still exists today alongside the modern Bishopsgate police station. As Kate left the station, Hutt asked her to shut the door behind her. "All right," she chirped. "Good night, old cock." So saying, she made her way along Rose Alley and turned along Bishopsgate, heading in the direction of Houndsditch. She would be dead within the hour. Hutt later estimated that it would have taken her around 8 minutes ordinary walking to reach Mitre Square. The tragedy of Catherine Eddowes is that she was found drunk on City of London police territory. Had she been a few yards to the east of Aldgate High Street, just beyond the traffic lights, she would have been on Whitechapel High Street and within the jurisdiction of the Metropolitan Police. The two forces had different ways of dealing with drunks. The policy of the City of London Police was to lock anyone up found drunk in their area, wait for them to sober up, and then release them, as happened in Catherine's case. Conversely, the Metropolitan Police would hold them overnight and they would appear in court the next morning. Had Catherine been found drunk on the other side of the traffic lights, she would have faced a court appearance and a fine, but she would have survived the night. At 1:30 on the morning of the 30th of September, City Police Constable Edward Watkins walked through the square on his beat. He had his lantern on and fixed to his belt. He was emphatic that the square had been quite deserted at that time and that no one could have been hiding there without him seeing them. Around 5 minutes later, commercial traveller Joseph Lavender, butcher Joseph Hyam Levy, and furniture dealer Harry Harris, members of the Imperial Club, a club for local businessmen located on Duke Street, now called Duke's Place, left the club and headed in the direction of Church Passage, the southeastern entrance to Mitre Square. As they passed the passage, they saw a man and a woman standing under the gas lamp over the entrance. The woman had her back to the trio, so they didn't see her face, but Joseph Lavender later identified Catherine Eddowes' clothing as that was worn by the woman. Levy wasn't impressed at the sight of the couple and said to Harris, "Here, I'm off. I don't like the look of those people over there. I don't like going home by myself at this hour of the morning. I don't like passing this class of person." Joseph Lavender, however, was a little less disgusted and glanced briefly at the man as he passed the couple. Despite later claiming that he wouldn't be able to identify the man were he to be confronted with him again, he was later able to provide quite a detailed description of him. He had, he said, the appearance of a sailor, was aged about 30, around 5'9" tall, of medium build with a fair complexion and a small, fair moustache. He sported a reddish handkerchief tied in a knot, wore a pepper and salt loose-fitting jacket, and had on a grey peaked cloth cap. The three men continued on their way, and none of them looked back once they had passed the couple. The couple had gone from the spot when, 5 minutes later, City Constable James Harvey walked his beat past Church Passage. He even went down the passage, checking the doors of the premises on either side, but saw nothing. However, he stopped short of entering Mitre Square, but walked back down the passage and continued on his beat along Duke Street. At 1:44 a.m, just a few minutes after Harvey had completed his examination of Church Passage, Constable Watkins turned out of Leadenhall Street, headed along Mitre Street and veered right into Mitre Square. Shining his bullseye lamp into the dark recesses of the square, he noticed something in the southwest corner. Approaching, he shone his lamp onto it and saw to his horror that it was the mutilated body of a woman. Recoiling in shock, he raced across the cobbles and burst into Keely & Tong's warehouse to alert George Morris. "For God's sake, mate," he stammered, "come to my assistance. Here is another woman cut to pieces." Pausing momentarily to get his lamp, Morris followed the officer back across the square, took one look at the body, and raced off along Mitre Street, blowing furiously on his whistle to raise the alarm. Police officers were soon converging on Mitre Square from all directions, and they began fanning out into the surrounding streets in search of the killer. But their efforts proved fruitless. The murderer, it seemed, had melted into thin air, and nobody had seen a thing. George Morris confessed himself totally baffled as to how such a brutal crime could have been committed so close to his place of work without him hearing a sound. He could hear the footsteps of the policeman as he passed on his beat every quarter of an hour, the Illustrated Police News reported. It was only the other night that he remarked to some policeman that he wished the butcher would come round Mitre Square and he would give him a doing. Yet the butcher had come, and he was perfectly ignorant of it.
Kosminski was born in 1865 on the 11th of September. He was born in Poland. He would eventually move to London in the 1880s, where he worked as a barber and lived a poor life. Kosminski lived in the Whitechapel during the time of the murders. On the 12th of July 1890, Kosminski was taken to Mile End Old Town Workhouse after his mental illness got worse. His brother Wolf certified the entry. He was released 3 days later.
His record of admission provides more about his illness. He declares that he is guided and his movements altogether controlled by an instinct that informs his mind. He says that he knows the movements of all mankind. He refuses food from others because he is told to do so, and he eats out of the gutter for the same reason. Jacob Cohen, who in 1891 was in business with Aaron's brother-in-law, Wolfe Abrahams, at 51 Carter Lane, St. Paul's, provided a little more information, stating that he goes about the streets and picks up bits of bread out of the gutter and eats them. He drinks water from the tap and he refuses food at the hands of others. He took up a knife and threatened the life of his sister. He is very dirty and will not be washed. He has not attempted any kind of work for years.
On the 4th of February 1891, he was returned to the workhouse, possibly by the police. Then on the 7th of February, he was transferred to Colney Hatch Lunatic Asylum.
And so, Aaron Mordecai Kosminski began his stay at Colney Hatch Asylum, and thereafter the records about him become somewhat sparse.
February 10th, 1891, he was noted as difficult and delusional. He refused to be cleaned. On April 21st, he was noted as still refusing to bathe, preferring to be unclean. On January 9th of 1892, he was said to be incoherent, and at one point, he threw a chair at an attendant. At the end of his life, he was unable to hold conversations and answer questions.
It wasn't until the early 1980s that what Chief Inspector Donald Sutherland Swanson had known about the case was unearthed by his descendants, and his revelations were, to say the least, intriguing. At the foot of page 138 in his copy of Anderson's book, under the passage in which Anderson had mentioned that the only person who had ever had a good view of the murderer had unhesitatingly identified their suspect but had refused to give evidence against him, Swanson had penciled the following explanatory note. Because the suspect was also a Jew, and also because his evidence would convict the suspect, and witness would be the means of the murderer being hanged, which he did not wish to be left on his mind. DSS. Swanson appears to have ruminated on Anderson's musings, and he had later returned to this passage and had underlined Anderson's claim that the witness had identified the suspect the instant he was confronted with him. He had also added in the left margin, and after this identification, which suspect knew, no other murders of this kind took place in London. Swanson then expanded further on the book's end paper. Continuing from page 138, After the suspect had been identified at the seaside home, where he had been sent by us with difficulty in order to subject him to identification, and he knew he was identified. On suspect's return to his brother's house in Whitechapel, he was watched by police, City CID, by day and night. In a very short time, the suspect, with his hands tied behind his back, he went to Stepney Workhouse and then to Colney Hatch and died shortly afterwards. Kosminski was the suspect. In 1898, Macnaghten's friend, the popular author and military historian, Major Arthur Griffiths, published Mysteries of Police and Crime, part of which dealt with the Whitechapel murders. Whilst researching the book, Griffiths almost certainly consulted Macnaghten about the fate of the perpetrator of the atrocities, and from the following passage it would appear that Macnaghten gave him access to the report that he had compiled in 1894. Griffiths wrote that, "The outside public may think that the identity of that later miscreant, Jack the Ripper, was never revealed. So far as absolute knowledge goes, this is undoubtedly true. But the police, after the last murder, had brought their investigations to the point of strongly suspecting several persons, all of them known to be homicidal lunatics, and against 3 of these they held very plausible and reasonable grounds of suspicion. Concerning 2 of them, the case was weak, although it was based on certain suggestive facts. One was a Polish Jew, a known lunatic who was at large in the district of Whitechapel at the time of the murder, and who, having developed homicidal tendencies, was afterwards confined in an asylum. There can be little doubt that the person being referred to by Griffiths in this passage is Macnaghten's Kosminski, and that the source of the information was therefore Macnaghten himself. Interestingly, 2 other high-ranking police officers who were more closely associated with the investigation into the crimes than Macnaghten was, and who had a more in-depth knowledge of the evidence and any suspects, did, so it would later be revealed, consider Kosminski to be their prime suspect.
A discovery was made in 2014 when a DNA analysis claimed to link him to a shawl found near one of the crime scenes. The evidence, however, was disputed by various experts and critics.
Has one of the world's most notorious murder mysteries finally been solved? A tiny trace of DNA on a Victorian shawl could hold the key to the true identity of the serial killer known as Jack the Ripper, who killed 5 women in London 126 years ago. Author Russell Edwards claims Aaron Kosminski, a 23-year-old Polish immigrant who ended up dying in an asylum, was definitely the man behind the killing spree in 1888.
I'm 100% certain. Definitive proof, conclusively proven. Put the case to bed. We've done this.
Edwards said a blood-stained shawl he bought in 2007 at an auction in Suffolk held the vital information which led him to the killer. He enlisted the help of a forensic scientist, Dr. Jari Luhainen, to analyse a shawl said to have belonged to one of the victims.
The DNA doesn't really lie, so if you have a long stretch of human DNA that doesn't appear from nowhere, so that's how sure we can be.
Perhaps the most notorious whodunit has finally been solved.
The level of sensitivity for forensic tests has improved tremendously over the years, and even a small DNA sample can now generate a big break in a case.
Nowadays, with the techniques and applications, you can have degraded DNA, meaning smaller pieces of DNA, and still generate a profile. And it looks like the technology is even going smaller pieces of DNA to generate a profile.
However, there are critics of these latest developments involving Jack the Ripper. Those critics have questioned the science used to identify him.
Was Aaron Kosminski, the Whitechapel murderer, known as Jack the Ripper? Was there more than one killer? This mystery may never be solved, but what we can say for certain, Kosminski's DNA and Catherine's DNA were found on the same shawl.